Hey everybody, I'm Shane, and we're in the final week of a series called Playbook. If you've been here over the past 3 weeks, then you know what we're talking about. We're talking about temptation, which I get can sound a little scary, but we've just been saying that temptation invites you to do something that may not be best for you. We've learned along the way that when it comes to temptation, we all need a little help. We need a playbook to help us resist it when it comes our way. And this week, we're unpacking an important play in the playbook, a play that all of us will need to have. But before we get there, let me tell you a quick story. Do any of you have a curfew? I did. I definitely did in middle school. And here's the thing about it is every time I could just feel the curfew coming up close, I would look at my watch. Yes, literally I had a watch. Well, I also had one of those brick phones that, it's not important, okay? But just stay with me. I would look at the clock and I'd realize like I'm minutes away from curfew. And you know what I would do? Well, I would give into temptation, set my phone or my watch aside, and just keep hanging out with my friends. I know, like that makes no sense at all, right? But I wanted to keep hanging out or playing football or whatever it was, and I completely ignored my curfew. And I did that knowing that there would be big consequences once I got home. What was funny is that bike ride home, every single time, I'd have all sorts of feelings. I'd be afraid of what the consequence was gonna be. I'd be just terrified to walk in the house. I'd be trying to make up a story of what made me late. Like I would face more temptation to lie about the situation. It was a mess of different emotions. You've probably been there too, right? I mean, the temptation that you gave into may not be the same as breaking curfew, but you can probably relate to the feelings that came with it. You give in, you do something you know isn't good for you, and then, well, you're probably left with all kinds of confusing feelings. For some of us, it's a feeling of embarrassment, guilt, or even shame. We're embarrassed that we gave in. We feel guilt over the choice that we made. We carry the shame of that decision with us. And with all that, we worry what people will think if they find out what we've done. Or maybe the opposite is true for us. If we're honest, we'd admit that we don't really feel guilty at all. Maybe it's because we don't think what we did was wrong. Maybe we've been doing it so long without consequence that it doesn't feel all that wrong. That happened to me with curfew. Or maybe because everybody else acts like it isn't that big of a deal, we feel the same way. Whatever the reason, giving into temptation doesn't feel that bad to us. Or maybe we get upset and we play the blame game. Our friends made us do it, right? I had to keep playing football. There were 2 plays left and the game was on the line. Sorry, I'm a little bit late. Or maybe we cheated because our teacher gave us way too much to study for the test. Like whatever it is, we think, I broke that rule because it's a pointless rule anyways. We look to get upset with and blame everyone else but ourselves when we give into a temptation. Now, some of us, we may try to keep what we did a secret. We want to cover it up. We make excuses for what we did or where we are. We might even lie or deny the whole thing. We do whatever it takes to make sure that nobody else finds out. Each and every one of these feelings or responses when we give in to temptation, they're normal. They're things that we all might do. But the reality is, they don't make things better. In fact, dealing with temptation like this usually makes things worse. So what can we do? When we've given into temptation, is there a better way to respond, to start over, to change the path that we're on? When it comes to temptation, what's the next play in the playbook once we've given in? Well, to help us figure that out, we're gonna talk about a guy named David. He lived around 3,000 years ago, and his story is documented in the part of the Bible called the Old Testament. When we're first introduced to David in the Old Testament, he was just a shepherd boy. But by the time his story was through, David had accomplished so much more. He eventually became a king, and even became known as a man after God's own heart. I don't know about you, but when I hear all that, I think that this David guy, he had to have had it all together, right? Like he probably never gave in to the kind of temptations that would mess up the good thing that he had going. Problem is, that's the exact opposite of how David's story went. When David was king over Israel, he was doing a really great job. He was winning a ton of battles, his kingdom was growing, and his people, they really liked him. That's all good news, right? Well, all of that changed with one decision. Late one day, after resting for a while, David got up out of bed and he wandered to the roof of his palace. And there, he noticed a beautiful woman named Bathsheba bathing across the way. Needless to say, David was tempted. What did he do? I mean, this was a man after God's own heart. David was the king of Israel, the king of God's chosen people, and a leader that everyone loved. Obviously, he walked away, went back to his room, and nothing bad happened, right? Wrong. David used his authority as king to have Bathsheba brought to his home, where he took advantage of his power by sleeping with her. And while we don't know a lot about Bathsheba and what she felt at that moment, it's safe to assume that this was not a situation that she wanted to be in. After all, she was married to a man named Uriah, someone who was out fighting for David's army. She likely knew that there would be consequences if anyone found out what happened to her. And honestly, that sounds really, really unfair to me. David was the one who made the decision to give in to temptation, but the consequences of that choice would impact more than just himself. So what happened next? Did David tell anyone about what happened with Bathsheba? Did he apologize or try to make it right? No, not at all. He just tried to make it seem like it never happened. Then David started doing what so many of us do when we give in to temptation. He manipulated the situation in an attempt to keep his mistake a secret. He went so far as to have Uriah sent to the front lines of the battle so that he might be killed. And in fact, he was killed. And at that point, David thought, well, once he's gone, I can marry Bathsheba and maybe this whole thing will just go away. Let's review the play David ran real quick. David was supposed to go to war. Instead, he stayed home. Temptation led David to sin. Then, the guilt, fear, and shame David felt led him to cover it up and send Uriah to the front lines of the battle where he was ordered to be killed. With Uriah out of the way, David thought that he could marry Bathsheba and move on from the mess that he made without consequence or fear. None of this is good, right? I mean, David knew what he did was wrong. He knew he was making mistake after mistake, but he kept going. Why would he do that? Well, like we talked about in this series, the avalanche of temptation and sin, it was in full effect. The mistakes that he was making were getting bigger and more out of control. David believed that he had no way out. He was so far into this mess that he'd made that he just didn't know how to change the story. And this is really important for us to consider. This was not the game plan in the playbook. David decided to take matters into his own hands. The issue was David, not the playbook. And in the middle of that, David also felt really distant from God. And we know that because he actually wrote about it in the book of Psalms in the Bible. There, David wrote that he felt a lot of the same feelings that we all may have felt when we give into temptation. He used phrases like crushed, cast out, or removed, and joyless to describe it. But here's what we also know to be true of David's story. It didn't end there. God didn't give up on him. God didn't throw his hands in the air and say, well, David, you gave in to temptation, nothing I can do now. No, David actually did a lot of great things after this. But in order to really go on with his life, he had to do one thing: ask for God's forgiveness. In one of the Psalms, David wrote this prayer to do just that. Don't keep looking at my sins. Remove the stain of my guilt. Create in me a clean heart, O God. Renew a loyal spirit within me. In our words, that prayer might sound like this: God, forgive me for my sins. Forgive me for doing something I knew wasn't good for me or for the other person. Help me to get over the guilt I feel because of what I've done. Change my heart and help me to choose to follow your ways instead of my own desires. Here's the deal. David still had to face some major consequences from those bad choices. I mean, he made some really, really bad decisions. He abused his power, did some pretty awful things. Asking for forgiveness doesn't mean that we don't have to deal with the fallout of our decisions. In fact, part of receiving forgiveness and moving forward is acknowledging what we've done and asking for help to make it right. Even though David did that, there were some things that he just couldn't make right. But because David received forgiveness from God, he could walk forward without fear and shame. Even after the decision to give into temptation and hurt Bathsheba, Uriah, and even more people with his actions, and knowing that the consequences remained because he made a really bad decision, God still gave David what God gives all of us: forgiveness. Reconnected to God, reconnected to others, forgiven. When we fail to follow the playbook, it doesn't mean life is over. We don't have to stay stuck in the choices that we've made or the feelings we feel because of them. Forgiveness was the key for David to get back to the playbook. And it's the key for you and me too. When we give into temptation, it doesn't mean life is over. And that's because of forgiveness. So, if you found yourself wondering what to do next, if you're struggling with guilt, fear, or shame after giving into a temptation, if you're finding yourself making mistake after mistake after mistake, if you're trying to keep your choices secret, a different story is still possible for you. And I can tell you that's true because I've experienced it in my own life as well. And here's how that story starts. First, ask for forgiveness from God. Tell God about the temptations that you've given into and how it's made you feel. Ask for God's help to change your story. Start moving forward today by asking God for the forgiveness you need. What I've learned in those moments is that when you ask God, what you receive is love and kindness. We don't have to be afraid to do it. God wants to give us the forgiveness that we need. And then ask for forgiveness from others. When we make poor choices, it often affects those around us. That's exactly what happened to Bathsheba and Uriah. That's really clear in the story. So part of moving on and moving forward is taking responsibility for the way that our choice to give in to temptation may have affected someone else. Be brave enough to ask for forgiveness from those that you may have hurt. It's definitely not easy, but it's so incredibly important for you to be able to change your heart and change your own story going forward. Also, forgive yourself. Sometimes this can be the hardest step to take. I know that's been true for me. Even when you know that God has forgiven you, even after you've apologized and owned it, it can still be really difficult to forgive yourself. You beat yourself up and you worry that you're gonna mess up again. And when you get stuck there, keep reminding yourself of God's forgiveness. Ask for God's help to remember that your story isn't over. And then second, after you've asked for forgiveness, revisit the playbook. If you don't want to find yourself in the same situation in the future, you've got to figure out what to do differently next time. You've got to revisit the playbook to determine what you missed to resist that temptation. That might mean making some tough choices, like not hanging out with certain friends, asking your parents for better boundaries for your phone or computer. It could be not watching that show or that movie, or like in my case of struggling to keep curfew, it could have been leaving 10 minutes before I needed to be home to make sure that I hit the curfew. Look, whatever it looks like for you, do it. Revisit the playbook and make a new plan. And consider telling somebody like a parent, guardian, or small group leader about it. Ask them to encourage you to stick to the playbook as you navigate temptation. How cool is it that moving forward can start right now? That we can all receive forgiveness no matter where we are or what we've done. The best part is we don't have to do it on our own. You have a small group of friends and leaders who want to help you forgive yourself and move forward with Jesus. There are people who want to support you and encourage you to remember that when we fail to follow the playbook, it doesn't mean life is over. So when you head to your group, think about this question. What's one thing you want to add to your playbook to help you avoid giving in to the same temptation?